George Weigel's latest book, Lessons in Hope, My Unexpected Life with St. John Paul II, is the third panel, if you want, in a triptych of books that he's written. So go back to Witness to Hope, and then The End and the Beginning were discussions of John Paul II's life, and they were marked by lots of careful analysis, probably tens of thousands of footnotes. This third book is much more personal, much more anecdotal. It's really about the interweaving of these two lives, Weigel's own and John Paul II's, as a kind of illustration of John Paul's principle that for people of faith there are no coincidences, but just aspects of God's providence we haven't fully understood. So Weigel reads the intertwining of these two lives as an exercise in God's providence, and is always the case with God's providence. It was to the mutual benefit of both. Weigel recounts really how his distant preparation for this task began when he was a young man and a student of Western philosophy, which prepared him very well to analyze the life of a pope whose mind was very much shaped by the metaphysics of St. Thomas Aquinas and the phenomenology of Edmund Husserl. So Weigel, as a student of philosophy, was positioned well to tell that story. The second thing that really prepared him was his immersion in what I would call the Sturm und Drang of the immediate post-conciliar period, when, for an awful lot of Catholic intellectuals, Vatican II represented a sort of first step in the right direction toward the total modernization of the Church. The idea being that the Church really was there to accommodate itself to the times, rather than to read the signs of the times through the lens of the gospel, which was what Vatican II actually taught. But Weigel's growing dissatisfaction with the regnant Catholic liberalism of the time led him to such thinkers as Henri de Lubac and Joseph Ratzinger and Hans Urs von Balthasar, three figures who had a big impact on the mind of St. John Paul II. I think a third element that he especially emphasizes in his preparation is his immersion in the political and cultural life of Poland in the wake of the events of 1989. So Weigel becomes a student of Polish culture, a student of that particular revolutionary change. And this came through real strongly in the book, that everyone he talked to, this means academics, it means people on the street, it means union organizers, it means everybody in between, they all said, when they were asked, okay, what was the real turning point? June 1979, which means John Paul II's first trip to Poland. That famous speech he gave in Victory Square in Warsaw, where he spoke of human rights, he spoke of God, he spoke of providence and salvation, and the people responded with that famous 15-minute long chant of, "We want God, we want God." And so Weigel began to think through that experience in light of that event, that John Paul's calling upon the Catholic intellectual and spiritual tradition was what triggered this massive change. So those three things, I would say, prepared him for the rather fateful night, 1995, when he had dinner with Stanisław Dziwisz, who was John Paul's secretary, with Richard John Neuhaus, and with John Paul II himself, during which dinner, John Paul essentially popped the question, where he asked Weigel if he would be his biographer. And Weigel knew that, like it or not, his life would totally change upon saying yes to that invitation. A part of the book I found surprisingly interesting was when Weigel went into the years of preparing this biography. And you'd think, okay, an academic telling you about how he wrote a biography wouldn't be all that compelling. But in fact, it is. All these conversations he had with a range of people who influenced John Paul II. And I think the very best and most intriguing were his conversations with John Paul II's youth group. So these people now, fully adults, but who as young kids were shaped by Karol Wojtyła. These stories, were very informative, very funny. The anecdotes are wonderful. So that part of the book I thought was surprisingly intriguing. I was especially struck in the second part of the book, second half of the book, by the many accounts that Weigel has of his lunches and dinners with John Paul II. So John Paul was famously gregarious and loved to have people over to his apartment for lively dinner conversations. And that's how he kept plugged in, how he learned what was going on in the world, how he was learning about the latest philosophical trends and political movements and so on. So Weigel, with obvious delight, tells these stories of these dinners and lunches, marked by lots of laughter, marked by high-level intellectual conversations, marked by multiple languages. And as I read those accounts, I thought, in some ways, it's a beautiful metaphor for the whole of John Paul II's papacy. Lively, smart, multicultural, philosophically informed, deeply curious, full of gospel enthusiasm. It was like a leitmotif, like an icon, in some ways, of John Paul II's papacy. And you know what finally struck me was John Paul the humanist. I think as Weigel reads him, that maybe is the interpretive key. So John Paul famously would make reference to Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 22. So the Vatican II document, Gaudium et Spes. And this paragraph 22 has the line about, it's in light of the Word made flesh that human beings really understand who they are. In other words, Christology is the key to the proper humanism. John Paul diagnosed the central problem of the 20th century, which was marked by the worst totalitarianisms, the worst expressions of violence. The fundamental problem was bad anthropology, a bad understanding of human beings. John Paul II, informed by the great Christian tradition and given focus by Gaudium et Spes 22, saw that the right anthropology is one that's grounded in Christology. The glory of God as a human being fully alive. God became human that we might become sharers in the divine nature. John Paul got all that, and not only got it intellectually, he got it in his bones, and then he exemplified it in his papacy. So those are a couple of lessons that I took from reading George Weigel's book, and I'd recommend it to anyone who's interested in John Paul II and interested in the life of the church now in our time.